Good morning, everyone. We're in Masechta Middos, Perek Beis, Mishnah Vav. And as we mentioned yesterday, we're moving forward into the Beis HaMikdash from east to west. So we entered the Har Habayis, the white area, through Shah Shushan Habira on the east. We entered the Soreg. We went into the Chayil. We came into the Ezras Nashim. We ascended the 15 steps. We came to Shar Nicanor. When you walk into Shar Nicanor, you're now in Ezras Yisrael. It's a thin but long area. It's 11 amos by 135. The entire structure, the width of the whole structure is 135, the structure of the Beis HaMikdash. So we're entering now, Shar Nicanor, and we're going into the first area designated Ezras Yisrael. And this Ezras Yisrael is where a Yisrael can go, meaning a Kohen and a Levi were able to go further under certain circumstances, mostly Kohanim. This is the designated area. It's narrow, but it's long. It's 11 by 135. This is where a Yisrael would be allowed to go. Now, he would be able to go a bit further if he was bringing a korban. You see the Mizbeach here, and that's going to be our subject, Belineda, for next week, how to build this Mizbeach. If a Yisrael was bringing a korban and he had to put his hands on the head of the korban, which is called smicha, or he had to come in and do tnufa, lift up some of the meat of the korban, or lift up a flour offering, those kinds of things that a Yisrael had to do, he had permission to go closer to this Mizbeach. Other than that, a Yisrael would be in this 11 by 135 area. Immediately after this 11 by 135 area, which is Ezras Yisrael, there is the Ezras Kohanim, which is again 11 by 135. So we're looking right now at the Ezras Yisrael. So the Mishnah says, Ulashakos hayu tachas Ezras Yisrael. There were rooms underneath the Ezras Yisrael. Upsuchos le'Ezras Hanashim. These rooms were open to the Ezras Nashim. Shasham halavim nosen kinoros unavolim umitzaltayim v'chol kli shir. The Levium who would sing the Shir Shel Yom at the Korban Tamid Shel Shachar and the Korban Tamid Shel Bein Ha'abayim every day, the morning and the afternoon, when the daily public Korban Siba was brought, some of them would be singing and some of them would be playing instruments. The instruments were placed in this room, which I'll show you in a moment, and there were harps and flutes and cymbals. These kind of musical instruments were placed in a room. You should have the diagram 18, I hope. This is what diagram 18 looks like. And it's giving you a picture. If you look at diagram 3, you see the semicircle of the 15 steps in the Ezras Nashim going to Shar Nicanor. And diagram 18 is now picking up in a much more detailed fashion those 15 steps. So diagram 18 shows you Ezras Nashim, 15 steps, and the Shar Nicanor. We explained last week that each of these 15 steps, all steps in the Beis HaMikdash, with rare exception, all steps were half amma in height and a half amma in depth. Depth meaning the place where you put your foot down. Half amma up, half amma in. That's how the steps were made, with a rare exception. So these 15 steps that go from the Ezras Nashim through the Shar Nicanor, and what's behind the Shar Nicanor? That 11 by 135 area called Ezras Yisrael in this diagram. Right behind Shar Nicanor, you have the 11 by 135. It's written on diagram 3. You have it there. It says Ezras Yisrael. Therefore, diagram 18, right behind this door is Ezras Yisrael. But because to get into Ezras Yisrael, you walked up 15 steps, and each step was half an amma, 15 times a half is 7.5, which means that the Ezras Yisrael behind this wall, the Ezras Yisrael, when you went through Shar Nicanor, is 7.5 amos higher than the Ezras Nashim. So the area behind these steps is now lifted up. It is 7.5 amos higher than the Ezras Nashim. If you walk in the Ezras Nashim, you're at one level. You walk up 15 steps, you go through the Shar Nicanor. Obviously, because you went up these steps, you're at a new level, a higher level. And that higher level is now 7.5 amos higher by virtue of those 15 steps. And now they're showing you the picture of the rooms we're talking about. Because the Ezras Yisrael, the area behind this wall is 7.5 amos higher than Ezras Nashim, there was sort of a basement. Underneath the Ezras Kohanim, there's a basement, because this area is 7.5 amos higher than the Ezras Nashim. And they use this lower basement area for things. And one of the things they had was on each side of the staircase, there was a room, and those are the rooms the Mishnah just discussed, where they put the musical instruments. Okay. So again, by virtue of these 15 steps, you created an elevation behind this door, and under that elevation, there's an area in which rooms were built. And here's in the Ezras Nashim, 2 doors. You can go into these rooms which are built under the Ezras Yisrael. And then you have these 2 rooms for the musical instruments. So if you think about this area where the musical instruments were, the floor of this room where the musical instruments were was the Ezras Nashim. But the roof, the ceiling of this room is in the Ezras Yisrael. Okay. You enter the room to get your musical instruments through the Ezras Nashim, because that's where the opening was. But the room itself the opening is in the Ezras Nashim. But when you walk into the room, it's a basement under the Ezras Yisrael behind this wall. So the ceiling of this musical instrument room is actually the floor of the Ezras Yisrael. And that's what the Mishnah is describing here. Now the Mishnah tells us something that I have mentioned several times, going back to diagram 3. Ezras Yisrael, which we just looked at, you walk through Shar Nicanor. We're making our visit into the Beis HaMikdash from east to west. You're now into the Ezras Yisrael. The length was 135, meaning from south to north, you had 135, and from east to west, 11. So again, in your diagram 3, Ezras Yisrael inside Shar Nicanor, from south to north is 135, which is the width of the Beis HaMikdash. From east to west, it's 11 amos. Now the Mishnah says we're moving further into the Beis HaMikdash. V'chein Ezras Kohanim. Again, you have in your picture it says Ezras Kohanim, which means you're moving further west into the Beis HaMikdash. We've gone through Shar Nicanor. We're in Ezras Yisrael. If for Yisrael, you can't go beyond this point, except if you need to do certain things for your korban at the Mizbeach. Otherwise, you stood here in this 11 by 135. But then Kohanim were able to go further. Obviously, they had to work at the Mizbeach. The Kohanim had an area called 11 by 1, called the Ezras Kohanim, which was also 11 by 135. And Kohanim were allowed to stand here even if they weren't doing the Avodah. If they had to do Avodah, obviously they would move further in westward to to the Beis Hamikdash. But here, Kohanim were allowed to stand even if they weren't partaking in the avodah, which means they had a little further that they can go into the azara, even if they weren't doing an avodah. So Yisrael, who had no need for avodah, he wasn't bringing a carbon, he had to stand here in the first 11 by 135. A Kohen can go a bit further, even if he wasn't doing avodah, an 11 by 135. A Yisrael who had to do something for his carbon was able to go further at the Mizbeach, and certainly a Kohen could go further if he had to do avodah. He would be able to go even into this chamber for Ketores or Lechem Aponim or to light the menorah. Obviously, the back chamber is the Kodesh Kadoshim, that's the Yom Kippur Kohen Gadol. Again, we are now talking about this area. We've gone through Shar Nicanor. And what happens when we go through Shar Nicanor? We've entered Azara. Ezras Noshim is not Azara. And because we've now entered Azara, the person has to be ritually pure to enter this area, perfectly ritually pure. If he's not, and he goes there in there intentionally, Chas v'sholem, he's chayiv the heavenly death of Koris. If he walks in here while he's tummy, but he does it b'shogeg, he has to bring a korban chatas. That is not the case in the Ezras Noshim, as we discussed. It had a higher kedusha than the Har HaBayis, but less of a kedusha than this Azora. So Mishnah says, "V'chein Ezras Kohanim," we're on page 39 of our Mishnahs. "V'chein Ezras Kohanim hoisa oyrech mea u'shlosha v'chomish al rochav achas esrei." Ezras Kohanim was the same size as the Ezras Yisrael, 135 by 11. For Roshei Pispasin, Mavdilim Ben Ezras Yisrael Ezras HaKohanim. We learned about this thing called Pispasin. When we learned about the Beis Hamokeh, going back to diagram 3, we learned about the Beis Hamokeh, which was on the northern wall of the Beis Hamikdash, of the Azara. And as you can see, this structure was partially in the Chayil and partially in the Azara. Therefore, this room, this Beis Hamokeh, had two separate halachas to it. There was part of it inside the Chayil, or the Har HaBayis, and part of it was in the Azara. And we know that there are separate rules about what you can do in the Har HaBayis and the Chayil and what you can do in the Azara. So this room had to have some line of demarcation so that someone inside the room would know, am I on the northern side of the Beis Hamokeh, in which case, for example, I can sit on the northern side of the Beis Hamokeh because that's the Har HaBayis or the Chayil. But I can sit on the southern side of the Beis Hamokeh because that's in the Azara and only a scion of King David can sit here. So how does a person know when he's in this chamber whether he's on the northern side of the chamber or the southern side of the chamber? He's in a closed chamber. So as we mentioned, there were Roshei Pispasin in this room. There are many explanations to Roshei Pispasin, and the explanation that we gave was that they made fists out of stone. They made something that looked like a fist, and they put it on the wall. And that was the line of demarcation. This half or this part of the room is part of the Chayil Har HaBayis, and you can sit there. And this part of the room is part of the Azara, and you can sit there. And that's how they split the two, so that where you were inside, you knew where the line of demarcation was. And they had to do the same thing here. How did a person who is a Yisrael know where the 11 ended? You know where the 135 ended because the 135 was north to south. You hit a wall. But how do you know where the 11 amos in width from east to west, where do you know where that ended? Because a Yisrael could not go into Ezras Kohanim except if you had to do avodah. So here too, there were Roshei Pispasim. They put these fists on the wall where the Ezras Yisrael ended and the Ezras Kohanim began. A person looked at the wall, he knew this is the end of Ezras Yisrael, and if you're Yisrael, you should not go further than that again, except for a korban. So they had the same type of idea, created a line of demarcation. Rashi Pispasin Mavdilim Ben Ezra Yisrael Ezra's Kohanim. These fists that were on the wall would separate between the Ezra's Yisrael, which is the first area you entered after Shar Nicanor, the Ezra's Kohanim, which was the second area. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, we mentioned several times that Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov is the author of Masechta Middos. And whenever he has he's the author of the whole Masechta, and in many places he has comments on the Mishnah that are his own personal Masorah that he has about how the Beis Hamikdash looked. So his opinion here is as follows. Let's just read the words, then we'll take a look at the diagram. We're going to be looking at diagram 17. You should all have a diagram number 17, and diagram 17 would look like this. It looks like a picture of steps. But first, let's read the words on page 39. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, Maila Hoisa, you didn't need Rashi Pispasin. Remember, we just said that according to the first opinion, you didn't know where Ezra's Yisrael ended and where Ezra's Kohanim began. Those are the two areas after Shar Nicanor. These are the two areas after Shar Nicanor. Each of them is 11 by 135. And you wouldn't know when one area ended and the next area began. So they put these fists on the walls as a line of demarcation. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says you don't need lines of demarcation on the wall because there was a construction inside the Ezra's Yisrael that would have told you where you are. And what's this construction? He says as follows. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer Maila Hoisa, there was a step, Ugvoa Amma, and this step was a half a Amma in height. Vahaduchan Nosun Aleha, the platform, which we call a duchan, the bama, the duchan, there was a platform on top of these steps. We'll see it in the diagram in a moment. And that's where the Leviim would stand when they sang their Shir Shel Yom in the morning and in the afternoon. Uva shalosh maila shel chatzi amma. And on top of this, step that was one amma, I want to call the first step not a step. We'll call it the pedestal. On top of this pedestal, there were three steps. The pedestal was an amma high, and each of the three steps on top of the pedestal was a half an amma high.
Maybe a landing. Maybe you could call it a landing.
Okay, we'll call it a landing. Thank you. The first area is a landing. This landing was a half an amma in height. And on this landing, they built three steps, each of which was 1.5 ammas. Nimtzis, therefore, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, that what happens is, Ezra's HaKohanim Gavoa me Ezra's Yisrael Shtei Amos Umachza. The Ezra's Kohanim didn't need a line of demarcation from the Ezra's Yisrael because the Ezra's Kohanim was elevated. It was higher than the Ezra's Yisrael by 2.5 amos. Now let's go to the diagram. We said that the Ezra's Yisrael, again, we look at diagram 3 one more time. You walk through Shar Nicanor, and now you're in the real Azorah. And the first area in the real Azorah, the Machne Shechina, is the Ezra's Yisrael. The Ezra's Yisrael is 11 wide. Now, if you are of the opinion, as the first opinion of the Mishnah was, that Ezra's Yisrael is completely flat, and the Ezra's Kohanim, the next place, is completely flat, so you just keep on walking. You don't know where you are. It's just one flat surface, Ezra's Yisrael and Ezra's Kohanim. If that's the case, I need some line of demarcation on the wall to tell me where Ezra's Yisrael ends and Ezra's Kohanim begins, because I'm on one flat surface. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says that's not the case. You don't need any indications on the wall, because between the Ezra's Yisrael and the Ezra's Kohanim, there was this structure, which means the Ezra's Yisrael is even smaller than we thought in terms of standing room. Instead of it being 11 wide, it is actually 9 wide. And then they put a platform or a landing. That platform or landing was 2 amos wide. Let's forget about the steps that are on top of the landing for a moment. The open area of the Ezras Yisrael is 9 amos wide. And then the last 2 amos of the Ezras Yisrael, they built a landing. So you have 9 amos wide open for standing purposes, and then you have a 2 amma wide landing. Okay, so that's 11. On this landing, they now constructed 3 steps. Each step was a half an amma high. This first landing is 1 amma high. Each of the steps built on the landing is a half an amma high. And it is on these steps that the Levium stood, which we call Duchan, and they sang the shir of the Yom at the Korban Tamid Shel Shachar and Korban Tamid Shel Bein Habayim. So the Ezras Yisrael, in fact, is 11 amos. It's 9, which remained wide open for standing, plus another 2. However, on this 2, they constructed the landing and the Duchan. And that makes up the 11 amos of the Ezras Yisrael. But Rebbe Eliezer ben Yaakov says, you don't need any lines of demarcation on the walls to tell you where you are, because you have these steps. And at the top of the 3rd step, that's the end of Ezras Yisrael. If you move further off that step, you're now in Ezras Kohanim. So you don't need any line of demarcations on the wall. You know exactly where you are. Ezras Yisrael, Duchan, 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 3 steps, and then you're in Ezras Kohanim. You know exactly where you are by virtue of this landing and the steps. As we mentioned yesterday, this Duchan is used for the Levium to sing their shir every morning and every afternoon, which we call the shir shel Yom. That has nothing to do with the 15 steps that are at Sha'ar Nikanor. Those 15 steps is where the Levium stood only Sukkos at the Simchas Beis HaShoeva. The singing of Simchas Beis HaShoeva is at the Sha'ar Nikanor. The singing every day by the Levium is on this Duchan. This is not the Duchan where Kohanim, quote unquote, Duchan. This is not the Duchan for Birchas Kohanim. We're going to get to that later in the Masechta. If you want to know where Kohanim Duchan in the Beis HaMikdash, it's at a place we haven't learned about. This rectangular structure, which is called Ulam, has 12 steps in front of it. If you're walking through Sha'ar Nikanor, we just spoke about Ezras Yisrael, Ezras Kohanim, a space, Mizbeach, and then 12 steps. It is on these 12 steps outside the rectangular building called Ulam. That's where the Kohanim stood and blessed the Jewish people. That's the place where they would say Birchas Kohanim. Not this Duchan. The Duchan was for the Levium. So if a Jew wanted to hear Birchas Kohanim, where would a Yisrael go? Enter Har Habayis. Again, we're using the simple case of Shushan Habira. Enter Har Habayis, Shushan Habira East. Walk through the Soreg, walk through the Chel, walk through the Ezras Noshim, take the 15 steps up to Sha'ar Nikanor, walk into Sha'ar Nikanor, and then he had this area called Ezras Yisrael. He would stand there, because assuming he's not bringing a carbon, he would stand there, and you'll be able to hear the Kohanim duchening on these 12 steps. Okay. Kol HaZorah. Therefore, according to Rebbe Eliezer ben Yaakov, one more point. According to Rebbe Eliezer ben Yaakov, let's go back to the first opinion in the Mishnah. The first opinion in the Mishnah said that the Ezras Yisrael and the Ezras Kohanim were one flat level. This area wasn't there for a Duchan. Where the Levium sang their shir according to the first opinion in the Mishnah, we're not going to go into it. But the first opinion in the Mishnah says this is a flat surface, just straight. And therefore, if it's straight, how do you know where the Ezras Yisrael ends and the Ezras Kohanim begins? They had these fists on the wall as a line of demarcation. Fine. Rebbe Eliezer ben Yaakov says you don't need these fists on the wall because you have a line of demarcation. You have a landing and 3 steps. It tells you exactly where you are. But now, according to Rebbe Les Ben Yaakov, what just happened? We have a new incline in the Beis Hamikdash. The Ezras Yisrael and the Ezras Kohanim are not on a flat surface. Here, you have the landing is 1 amma high, and you have 3 steps. Each step is a half an amma high. 1 amma plus 3 1/2 amos equals 2.5 amos. 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5. Which means that the Ezras Kohanim is 2.5 amos higher than the Ezras Yisrael. So now let's see what's happening to our Beis Hamikdash that we're building. We entered the Har Habayis through Shushan Habira. We came through the Soreg, that thin wall beyond which Goyim couldn't go and a Tamei Meis couldn't go. We walked up 12 steps and we entered the Ezras Noshim. So now the Ezras Noshim is 6 amos higher than the Har Habayis. We continued walking. We came to the 15 steps of the Shar Nikanor. 15 steps, each step a half an amma, 7.5 amos. So when you walked into Shar Nikanor and you walked into the Azorah, you're now 7.5 amos higher than you were when you were in the Ezras Noshim, and 13.5 amos higher than you were in the Har Habayis. You walked into the Har Habayis, you elevated 6 through the Ezras Noshim, and then you elevated another 7.5 to get into the Ezras Yisrael. In the Ezras Yisrael, you're now standing 13.5 amos higher than the Har Habayis. According to Rebbe Les Ben Yaakov, you now went up again 2.5 amos because of the landing and the steps. So now you're 13.5 plus 2.5 is 16. According to Rebbe Les Ben Yaakov, the Ezras Kohanim is 16 amos higher than the Har Habayis. So, again, one more time. Ezras Noshim, 6 amos higher than the Har Habayis. If you walk into the Ezras Yisrael, you're 13.5 amos higher than the Har Habayis. If you went to the Ezras Kohanim, because of Rebbe Les Ben Yaakov's platform, landing plus steps, you're now 16 amos higher than the Har Habayis, and it's going to get higher when we get to these 12 steps. But right now, in where we are in the Ezras Kohanim, we're now 16 amos, according to Rebbe Les Ben Yaakov, higher than the area around the Beis Hamikdash, the Har Habayis. So the Mishnah says, page 40, top line, Nimtzas, therefore, according to Rebbe Les Ben Yaakov, Ezras HaKohanim Gavoa Me Ezras Yisrael Shtei Amos Umachza. The Ezras Kohanim is 2.5 amos higher than the Ezras Yisrael, which is what we just explained. And altogether, it's now 16. Kol Azorah, the entire Azorah, diagram 3, the Azorah, not the Ezras Noshim. We already mentioned the Ezras Noshim is 135 by 135, done. We're now looking at this area. Kol ha'azorah hoya orech 108 v'sheva. The length of the Azorah, which means from east to west, this structure inside these dark black walls was 187 in length. Al rochav 135, the famous number 135. The Ezras Noshim is 135 by 135. That's the width, and the whole structure is 135. Except the Ezras Noshim is 135 by 135. The Azorah is 187 by 135. And later in the Masechta will explain to us this 187 exactly what were the measurements inside this 187. We now know part of the measurements. We know that in this 187, the Ezras Yisrael took up 11, the Ezras Kohanim took up 11, that's 22, and each of these areas will be measured until this entire area is 187. But we're not up to there yet. Now the Mishnah introduces us to a new opinion And this opinion disagrees with two basic facts that we've learned about until now. In Perek Aleph, we learned using this picture, but not fully this picture, but today we'll be able to use fully this picture. We learned in the first Perek that the Har HaBayis has 5 openings to it. Shushan Habira east, 2 Shari Hulda south, Shari Kipunas in the west, and Shari Tedi in the north. And then we learned that the Azara has 7 openings. 1 on the east, Shari Nicanor, 3 on the north, and 3 on the south. 7 openings into the Azara, and that's what we learned in Perek Aleph. We also learned recently that the Soreg had 13 punctures in it. When the Greeks dominated the Beis Hamikdash, they made 13 holes into the Soreg. The Soreg was the demarcation where a Gentile couldn't go, and the Greeks didn't like that idea that they couldn't go where they want in the Beis Hamikdash. So they put 13 punctures in there as a sign that the 13 Shvatim, we are no different than the 13 Shvatim when you count Levi as a Shevet. We're no different than the 13 Shvatim. We can go wherever we want in the Beis Hamikdash as well, and they put 13 puncture holes in there, and later the Hashmonaim sealed it up. According to that opinion, we learned that whenever a person was walking around the Har HaBayis, and he came to a point in the Chayil that there was a puncture, or there used to be a puncture hole, you would bow down in gratitude to God for the victory of the Hashmonaim and retaking the Beis Hamikdash. So if someone walked around the whole Har HaBayis, he would bow 13 times at each of these 13 puncture marks, again, which were fixed. If you walked only on one side of the Har HaBayis, you may only bow 4 times or 5 times. But there were 13 places where a person would bow on the Har HaBayis. And that's what we learned. 2 points. 1, the Azara had 7 entries. And 2, the Chayil had 13 puncture points that came from the Yevonim. Now we're going to learn about a new opinion that disagrees with both of those points. Abba Yossi ben Hanan Omer, Abba Yossi ben Hanan disagrees with these 2 points. First, a line before that, page 40. Ushlosh esrei hishtachavoyos hayusham. There were 13 points where you were able to bow down around the Azara. Okay, let's leave it right now for the Azara, because this is what we're focusing on. Abba Yossi ben Hanan Omer, Abba Yossi ben Hanan says, the reason why you bow 13 times around this area is not because of anything to do with the Greeks. It's keneged shlosha osa sha'arim. It's because around the Azara, there were 13 entries, not 7. The first opinion that we learned about several weeks ago said there are 7 entry points into the Azara. So then why do you bow 13 times? Well, you bow 13 times because of the 13 punctures. No. Abba Yossi ben Hanan says there are actually 13 openings into the Azara, which we'll see in a moment. And those 13 openings is where you bow down. If you passed an opening, you bow down at that opening. And there were 13 openings. It has nothing to do with the Greeks. So therefore, he disagrees with that first Mishnah, that was the Mishnah we originally learned, and there were 13 openings. And now he's going to tell you where these 13 openings are. Meaning, we originally learned that there were 7 openings. We're now learning that Abba Yossi ben Hanan says there are 13, so we have to find 6 more openings into the Azara. So, Abba Yossi ben Hanan says as follows. We're looking now at our diagram number 3. And diagram number 3 actually shows you the 13 openings. When we studied diagram 3 originally, we only focused on 7. And the 7 were 3 north, 3 south, and 1 Nicanor. 3 north, 3 south, 1 Nicanor, 7. Now we're going to add 6 more. So Abba Yossi ben Hanan says, Keneged Shlosha Asa Sha'orim. Sha'orim Dromiim, the southern gates, Smuchen Lamaira. They were close to the western side of the Azara. Shar HaElyon, the upper gate, because it's the gate closest to the back of the Beis HaMikdash. And remember, the Beis HaMikdash is built on an incline, so it's the high gate. This is one of the gates that the original opinion did not include. The original opinion that we learned about did not have such a gate. Rabbi Yossi ben Chanan says this is a gate. So that's one new one. And then there's Shar Hadelek, which the original opinion did count. That's the place where they would bring in wood to put on the Mizbeach. Shar HaBechoros, which the original opinion also included. That's where they brought in Kachei Kalim, the animals that would be slaughtered for Kachei Kalim, the low-level carbon, low-level Kedusha. And Shar HaMayim. And finally, the Shar HaMayim, which the original opinion also included. V'lomanik v'shmo Shar HaMayim. Why was this called Shar HaMayim? Shebo nachnisen slocha shel mayim shel nisach b'chad. On Sukkot, they poured water on the Mizbech besides wine. That was the simplest Beis HaShoei, but the simcha of drawing of the water. That's the gate through which they brought the water in on Sukkot for the simplest Beis HaShoei. So it's called the gate of the water. So we now have 4 gates on the southern wall. The original opinion had 3 gates. We now have 4. So we have 1 new one. Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov Omer, we've learned this. Ubo hamayim mefakin basidim lios yotzim mitachas mifnan habayis. Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov says that another reason why the Shar Hamayim was called the Shar Hamayim is because Yecheskel prophesied that there would be a stream of water that would open in the Beis HaMikdash and flow out from this gate. Okay, so far we've added 1, but we need to add 6. Ulu Mosam Batzafon Smuch L'mayrav. Rabbi Yossi ben Chanan says, now let's go to the northern side. On the northern side, towards the west, Shar Yechonia. Now we call that the Beis Hanitzutz. This is not a new gate. The picture calls it Beis Hanitzutz. Rabbi Yossi ben Chanan called it Shar Yechonia, which we'll see why in a minute. That's not a new gate. Shar HaKorban, which the original opinion did have, so we still don't have a new one. Shar HaNoshim, that's a new one. The gate for women. This is a special gate that women were able to use when they had to come in because they were bringing a carbon. And they were allowed to come here to do whatever avoda was necessary for a woman to do. And that's a machlokes, what avoda. When I say avoda, we're talking about now smicha, putting hands on the carbon. So if a woman brought a carbon, she would put her hands on the animal. According to one opinion, there are other opinions that she didn't do that. At any rate, this is a new gate, according to Rabbi Yossi ben Chanan, and it's called Shar HaNoshim. So now we have 2 new gates. And then we go to, the Mishnah says, Shar Hashir. And Shar Hashir is what we call Shar Beis HaMoked. It is not a new gate. It's just a new name for the gate. So right now we have 2 new gates. On the southern wall, we have the Shar HaElyon, and on the northern wall, we have Shar HaNoshim. But we need 6 new ones. We're going to get to that in a moment. So the Mishnah says, V'lom and Nikushmo Shar Yechonia. Why was this gate, which we originally called Beis Hanitzutz, why was it called Shar Beis Yechonia, or Shar Yechonia? Shebo Yotza Yechonia Begaluso. Yechonia was one of the last kings of the Jewish people before Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the Beis HaMikdash. And he surrendered to Nebuchadnezzar. Rather than making Nebuchadnezzar come and destroy the Beis HaMikdash and kill the Jewish people, he decided that he was going to surrender. And Nebuchadnezzar took him to Bavel, didn't kill him, took him to Bavel. So this is called Shar Yechonia, because Yechonia, before he surrendered to Nebuchadnezzar, he went into this area prayed to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should protect him and the Jewish people, bowed in this shar, and then went and surrendered to Nebuchadnezzar. So originally, this shar is called Shar Yechonia, and later it became called Shar Beis Hanitzutz, the house of the spark. There was a small fire in there, and Chas v'shalom, the fire went out on the Mizbeach. They went into this room to get fire for the Mizbeach. Originally called Shar Yechonia, then later became known as Shar Beis Hanitzutz. So we only have two new gates, Shar HaElyon and Shar Noshim. Now the Mishnah tells us, Abi Yossi ben Chanan, where he got four more. Sheba Mizrach, on the east, to our famous Shar Nicanor, Abi Yossi ben Chanan says that at this big door in the east, Shar Nicanor, there was a small door to the right and a small door to the left. That's an additional two doors that you can use to enter the Ezras Yisrael. Shar Nicanor were very tall and very heavy. If someone needed to go into the area of the Azorah and didn't want to have to open these large doors, they had smaller, less heavy doors, right side and left side. So that's two more entryways into the Azorah. So we have four. So he says, Shar Nicanor Shnei Pishpishim Hoyelo. It had small little doors. Echad Mimino, one to the right, ve'echad Mismolo, one to the left. Ushnayim B'mayrav. And there were two openings to the Azorah in the west. Lahoyelahem Shem, they had no name because they were basically not used. And in this picture, here are two openings on the west wall of the Beis Hamikdash structure of the Azorah. So Abi Yossi ben Chanan took the original 7 gates, added the Shar HaNoshim, 1, added the Shar HaElyon, 2, added 2 small doors, right side and left side of Shar Nicanor, that's 4, and added 2 openings on the western wall of the Azorah, 6. So the first opinion said there are 7 openings into the Azorah. Abi Yossi ben Chanan says there are 13. We now know the additional 6. And Abi Yossi ben Chanan says the 13 times you bowed were not because of anything to do with the Yavanim, because there were 13 entryways into the Azorah, and every time you passed an entryway, you would bow. Baruch Hashem, as we had planned at the beginning of the week, Baruch Hashem, we have finished Perek Beis in Masechta Middos. And B'li we're going to continue next week. What happens next week, Amir Hashem? As we build the Beis HaMikdash, we've gone through Shar, we've gone through Shar Shushan Abira to get into the Harabayas. We went through the Soreg, we went through the Chayil, we went into Ezras Noshim, we walked up 18 steps to get to Nicanor. We walked through Nicanor. We got to the Ezras Yisrael, 11 by 135. According to Rabbi Les Ben Yaakov, you now have that platform with 3 steps above it. That brought you to the Ezras Kohanim. And now you're going to walk a little further. What are you going to come to now? That huge Mizbeach upon which animal sacrifices were brought. And so the third perek of Middos begins, HaMizbeach. That's what we're up to. We're going from east to west in the Beis HaMikdash. And the Mi'etz Hashem, beginning Yom Rishon, we're going to learn how to build the Mizbeach, which is an amazing, fantastic, the structure and the construction was just amazing how they did this. And we're going to learn a lot about changes that were made to the Mizbeach between the second Beis HaMikdash and the first. And we're going to have to study, again, remember we learned about the Ezras Noshim, the women's section, where they put brackets on the walls of the women's section. And the Gemara in Sukkah asked, how can you do that? You can't add anything to the structure of the Beis HaMikdash. It was God given to God, HaChozeh, and Nasan Hanavi, and they passed it on to David, who wrote it down. Hakol b'chsav miyad Hashem olai. All this has been transmitted from God, and David gave it to Shlomo. You can't add anything to the structure. But we're going to take a look. The Mizbeach in the first Beis HaMikdash was not exactly as it was in the Mishkan. And the Mizbech in the second Beis Hamikdash was not exactly as it was in the first Beis Hamikdash. It's an amazing area to learn, and this construction of how they did it was ingenious.